Alright guys, I'm going to show you how to take this Wildcat apart in the clutch. I've already taken off a few of the screws and bolts just to make things faster and easier. First thing you want to do is this clamp right here for the CVT exhaust. You need to pull it's 2 Phillips head screws. You need to loosen those screws up so you can get this CVT exhaust out and pull the boot. You want to pull the CVT exhaust out of the boot, and then you work the boot off. Once you get the boot off, you can take this snorkel and you want to pull it sideways, and don't be scared of this. It's going to make a heck of a racket. You just yank on it and they come out about like that. It's the only way I could get it out. Once you get that off, there is a bracket here for the air intake. I've already taken this bracket off. It's 2 bolt that bolt to the housing. This housing uses a T30 Torx, so we use a T30 Torx bit for it. Now on a few of these bolts on this housing, I did have to use a wobble extension so I could get to them. So if you've got one of those, use it. And if you also notice on this housing, there are 2 different length bolts. There's some short ones and some long ones. The long ones go in this bracket here, and I think 1 or 2 of these back here. You'll have to be sure you note which one uses the long bolts and the short bolt. The housing pulls straight down and away, revealing your clutches. You can see your primary and secondary here. One of the longer bolts threads into the secondary. The secondary is threaded, and one of these holes allows you to spread this clutch open. And if you'll notice, this stock clutch does not have a one-way bearing. It will spin freely both ways. Now when you take this long bolt, you want to spread this clutch open by just running it in. Once you run the bolt in, it spreads the clutch open so that you run the belt loose. Your primary is a 32mm, your secondary is a 37mm. And both of those are lefty-loosies. And in order to get the primary off without taking the shock off, we use a swivel and a 32mm. And these bolts, these nuts are Loctited on from the factory, so you will need a good impact to get them off. And you can grab the outer half of the clutch and slide it off. There's a black sleeve, and you can peel the belt off. The inner sheave of your primary slides out now. You take a 37mm to get the secondary off. And once we get that off, we can pull this guy straight off. Now if you'll notice these 2 little washers here, these are 2 shims. They align the belt with the primary. Be sure when putting this all back together, if you're putting the stock clutches all back on, be sure to keep these shims intact, because that's what keeps the stock clutches in line. You may only have 1 shim on your setup, you may have 2, just depends on what it took to get your secondary in proper alignment with the primary, but be sure you keep up with those shims. And now that you got your primary and secondary off, you can see the inner clutch housing, and it is all Torx 30. We'll take all of them off. Once we've got all those out, you do need to undo the front boot for your CVT inlet. This cover is siliconed on from the factory, so it may be a little hard to get off, but you should just be able to give it a tug and it come out. Now you can see the wet clutch cover with the CVT inlet. In this next step, what we're going to do is take the wet clutch cover off the side of the engine, and since the engine has oil in it, we can't take that cover off, otherwise it will spill the oil out onto the ground. So what we're going to do is we put a jack right here under this back corner. We're going to jack the machine up just a little to tilt the engine, and what that'll do is put the oil on the other side of the engine, and that way we won't spill it everywhere. Now you'll need to disconnect these 2 CVT inlets. You need to disconnect both of those hose clamps. And once you get those bolts out of this wet clutch cover, be sure you got this clamp right here undone. You can slide this guy right off of that inlet, pull it right out of there. Once you got the wet clutch cover off, you can see this is the wet clutch assembly here. This is a 24mm nut, and it is reverse threads, meaning you turn it to the right in order to loosen it. And this nut is also Loctited on from the factory, so it is rather difficult to get off. I would recommend that you have a good impact before attempting to get this guy off, because it is pretty tough. Once you get that 24mm nut, this wet clutch assembly will slide right out towards you. Now once you've got the wet clutch and the wet clutch cover off of your machine, they look like this right here. The wet clutch here on the right, the wet clutch cover along with its shaft on the left. Both of these pieces I do need in order to build you a wet clutch delete setup.